Welcome to Nordy. TK047 is with you, and today in a detailed review we will find out how good the Venator-class Star Destroyer, that was in service for more than 150 years, how it was used in battle by the naval commanders of the Republic and the Galactic Empire, what was its role after the Clone Wars, and much more other in this video article. In the description of the video there is a breakdown into chapters, and on the scroll bar, we are somehow approaching the first of them. So fasten your seatbelts, citizens of the galaxy far, far away. We are about to begin. The very name Venator, translated from Latin, means hunter. It was named so in honor of one of the specializations of ancient Roman gladiators. Yes, there is no ancient Rome in Star Wars, but there are names. Venators, like the bestiary, also a type of gladiator, fought in the arena with animals. And sometimes they showed all sorts of tricks to the exacting Roman public, thirsty for meal and reel. That is, it was something between a hunter and an artist of the ancient Roman theater. Venator, hunter, separatist hunter, Republican circus performer, tamer of wild separatist animals, a name with meaning. So as you know, when the Cominians were ordered to raise clone armies, weapons, equipment, ground vehicles, and space combat vehicles were created for them. In order not to waste time and money on the development of many types of equipment, new pieces of iron were often riveted on the basis of existing military and police vehicles. So for example, the ancestors of the ATRT was a police walker. The ancestor of the LAT was an analog of the police helicopter. The ARC-170 was created on the basis of the PTB-625 atmospheric bomber. The past of the ATTE Walker was almost civilian, and the juggernaut A5 completely rolled into the clone army without changes. But with Venator, things were different. The backbone of the Republic Navy had no direct predecessor. Moreover, the Venator became the ancestor of a whole generation of large warships, which received the codename Star Destroyer. By the way, the Venator is a heavy aircraft carrying cruiser, simultaneously being a Star Destroyer. And this is natural, because Star Destroyers were called warships of different types, classes and purposes, capable of literally incinerating the surfaces of planets in a few days, and destroying entire star systems in weeks, hence the names. For example, the Imperial Star Destroyer, abbreviated ISD, or as it was originally officially called in the Navy, the Emperor-class Star Destroyer. So this is a battleship. Now you have a page from the official reference book, Incredible Cross-Section, where this is written. Although wedge-shaped ships had existed before, but they were not considered Star Destroyers, and had hardly been built since the Ruusan Reformation. The still unnamed Mandalorian warship with similar hull lines, which once flashed through the pages of the 17th issue of the KOTOR comic series, cannot be considered an ancestor of the Venator. As Dark Horse Comics later admitted, this was an artist's mistake, which, due to the large volume of Star Wars productions produced in those years, was accidentally overlooked by the people responsible for the canon. So this ship, outwardly similar to the Venator, but only similar, is still part of the official Star Wars mythology. But he is not Venator's ancestor. By the way, in exactly the same way, due to an artist's unnoticed mistake in time, an Elegance-class Star Destroyer appeared in Star Wars at one time. Also, do not consider the ancestor of the Venator Harrower-class Star Dreadnought, the main capital warship of the fleet of the Sith Empire. Their tasks on the battlefield were similar, some design features were similar, and there was also some external similarity. However, at the same time, he was not the ancestor of the Venator. But still, you should not think that the Venator was designed completely from scratch. The creators of the Venator were the design bureau of the shipbuilding giant of the Quat Drive Yards Corporation, known throughout the galaxy. The Quatians had many thousands of years of experience in the development and mass production of large warships, including ships created relatively recently, the development experience of which formed part of Venator base. What is interesting and even more characteristic is that even one of the treaties that accompanied the Ruusan Reformation, which at one time significantly limited the size, firepower, and speed in space of warships, was not very much touched by the Quatians, a sort of analog of the Treaty of Versailles from the real world. The Quat Drive Yards Corporation, although located in the center of the galaxy near the capital, openly ignored the treaty that the Galactic Senate forced, under the threat of financial sanctions or worse, to fulfill all other governments. To some extent, the predecessor of the Venator can be considered the Quat Mandator-class Star Dreadnought, from which our hero borrowed many elements of the internal layout, and a number of design solutions. But in a reduced form, of course, because the length of the Mandator-class dreadnought reached 8 km. Of course, it was possible to adopt the Mandator already mastered in production or the modernized Predator-class Star Dreadnought, also a creation of the Kuat. But these were too large and therefore very expensive ships, which moreover were built for too long. Initially, the designers set out to develop something smaller and not as powerful as the Mandator or Praetor, but more suitable for high-volume production. And they succeeded. Even during the war, from the moment the ship was laid down to its descent from the stocks in a fully combat-ready state, it took no more than 4 months, well, or 2 to 3 months, if workers try hard and the shipyard is good. In shipyards simpler than the shipyards of Kuat or Rothan, the ship was assembled in 6 to 7 months, and just look at the Kuat shipyards and other planets of the system. In order not to bore you with numbers, suffice it to say that the Kuat Drive Yards Corporation, without much effort, could put into operation up to 1,200 ships in a year. Ships in the world of Star Wars are built very quickly, and therefore they are not particularly spared. Often abandoned or simply sent to the metal of the ship, which can still be repaired. Remember the junkyard from the game Jedi Fallen Order. But if for the Grand Army of the Republic they tried to mass-produce a Mandator or something similar to it, then it would take up to 2 years to assemble such a ship, even with the simultaneous assembly of modules on a dozen stocks. Why the Grand Army needed a new type of ship. At that time in the galaxy was dominated by the concept of large warships with mainly energy artillery weapons, laser, turbolaser, or ion cannons. Rockets and torpedoes, if installed, were considered secondary weapons, and hangars for small aircraft, that is, fighters and bombers, were quite rare. Especially hangars that allow you to take on board more than 1 squadron of heavy or 2 squadrons of light fighters. A good example, or even an icon of this concept, can be the most common large warship of those years, a Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser built by the Rendley Stardrive Corporation. This ship appeared more than 100 years before the Clone Wars, becoming actively exploited 80 years before the war. The first modifications of this ship had no hangars at all, only external docking stations. Then, modifications of dreadnoughts were built with a small internal hangar, but only as a necessary measure. The design of the ship did not allow to make a large hangar, and shortly before the crisis on Naboo, the Trade Federation and similar mega-corporations began to rapidly build up their own armed forces. Of course, the Trade Federation, and long before, had its own army and navy, but these were troops of the classical type. They were gradually replaced by battle droids, starfighter droids, and the like. This process became especially active after a cunning conspiracy involving the Sith. First of all, of course, Darth Sidious. When the Neimoidians began to dominate the Trade Federation leadership, that's when their famous droid army appeared. And then came the crisis on Naboo. On the scale of the galaxy, this of course was a minor event, because every day, somewhere in the vastness of the far distant, someone occupied, captured, bombed, genocide, imposed sanctions. In general, such a normal civilized life. But people who know how to think with their heads immediately realized that the concept of warfare has changed. After all, the Trade Federation relied on numerous unmanned fighters, bombers, a whole swarm of relatively cheap metal, which was difficult to cope with the existing ships with an emphasis on large guns. After all, even the same dreadnought was not very good with anti-aircraft guns. The military people came to the conclusion, since they have a swarm of fighters, they must respond with their own swarm of fighters, but at the same time, have a ship with powerful artillery weapons. This is how appeared the Venators and Acclamators in the modification of the aircraft carrier. It was precisely because of the threat of a big war that Kuat built for himself huge warships, the sight of which would make any competitor no longer want to argue. Venator's mother was the most talented shipbuilder Lyra Wessex, maiden name Blissex. She was the daughter of an equally talented shipbuilder, Valex Blissex. Dad and daughter were constantly competing with each other. For example, a design bureau led by Valex created the Delta 7 Interceptor, a Victory-class Star Destroyer. Further, for the New Republic, he also created the Republic-type Star Destroyer. And then, he had a hand in the creation of the Nebula-type Star Destroyer, also for the New Republic. Lyra, on the other hand, gave the galaxy Venator, Emperor, and then also managed to work on the Executor-class Star Dreadnought. Now let's move on to the Venator design. Although the most remarkable thing about the Venator is the hangar. That's why it is an aircraft carrier. Let's start the review of the ship with weapons. There is something to tell here. You now have a twin-gun turret with DBY-827 heavy turbolasers on the screen. Here is the main battery of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The turret and turbolasers were designed by Time and Back with input from Kuat Drive Yard's engineers, and the cannons were built entirely by Time and Back before the Clone Wars. This company was considered one of the galactic leaders in the market for blaster, laser, turbolaser cannons, although they tried to manufacture starships and speeders but did not succeed. Time and Back guns were later installed on almost all capital ships of the Galactic Empire, and then the New Republic. The DBY-827 is an extremely powerful weapon, even surpassing the main battery turbolasers of the Emperor-class Star Destroyers. Although the total energy of the ISD salvo was still more, to be precise by 30% due to the larger number of turbolasers, 64 ISD main caliber barrels versus 16 for the Venator. During the Clone Wars and after the war, the Venators often acted as battleships, but this was forced because in terms of total firepower, the Venators were inferior even to their contemporaries. The Victory-class Star Destroyer, although they were much smaller, well, it's hard to expect otherwise from a ship that is an aircraft carrier cruiser. The Venator's cannons had a fairly large sector of fire, about 150 degrees horizontally and about 90 degrees vertically. Their location at different levels in height made it possible to fire from all barrels along the course of the ship in the upper hemisphere. But it was not worth exchanging side salvos, since in this case only half of the guns could be used. However, Republican captains often solved this problem. They simply turned the ship on its side and fired as it were upwards. An attentive viewer will surely now remember the exchange of broadsides in the style of sailing ships of the 17th-19th centuries at the beginning of Episode 3. In the cinema, it was a kind of reference to the real battles of the sailing era. It looks beautiful, spectacular. Well, in the lore of Star Wars, this moment has an explanation. Such an airborne shootout turned out almost by accident. Originally, Guarlara, that Venator had such a name, had to attack the invisible hand of Grievous from a different angle, but it worked out. DBY-827 turbolasers had 7-shot power modes. At the lowest power, turbolasers could fire at a high rate and be used for barrage fire against fighters and bombers, thereby supplementing light laser guns. And at the highest power, which seriously loaded the ship's power system, causing rapid overheating of the battery, DBY-827 could easily make a through-hole 10 meters in diameter in the side of a corvette or even a frigate. In space combat, depending on the situation, 3 firing options were used. Option 1, an alternate shot in which the first shot pierced shields or armor, and the next one flew into the formed gap. The shots were fired at medium power, level 4 to 5. Very useful if you need to knock out a critical element of a warship such as an engine or a captain's bridge. But such a shot required very good artillery skills, reliable operation of sensors and aiming systems, and need for long-term aiming, which is not always possible given the enemy's electronic warfare, and still had to sacrifice the rate of fire. Naturally, such a sniper booklet was almost impossible when shooting at small ships that had high speed and maneuverability. Option 2, alternate firing from 2 barrels at a high pace. This way of using DBY-827 was not so destructive, but it looked more impressive. Shooting was carried out at low power level 1 to 3, but even at low power, turbolasers could not maintain a high rate of fire for a long time. After half a minute or a minute of firing, the fire had to be stopped, and the cooling systems should be allowed to cope with overheating. This mode was designed to defeat weakly protected, highly maneuverable, and fast targets, and this mode could also be used for fire support from the orbit of ground units. Option 3, simultaneous shot from 2 barrels at maximum power, level 6 to 7. This is the main firing mode in squadron combat with other capital ships and in orbital bombardment. At the same time, the rate of fire of the cannons was low and seriously strained the ship's reactor, but the effect was very destructive. By the way, pay attention to the dimensions of these guns and this tower. Judging by the figures of the clones in the picture, the diameter of the bore of this gun is about 6 meters. A 2-story country house can fit in it. And also this cable going under the reactor. Its diameter is about 8 meters. And a few more words about the power of DBY-827 turbolasers. You probably know about the order Base Delta Zero, destruction of the surface of the planet, And we all know that the ISD and the larger Star Destroyers were masters at exterminatus, but many may not know that this order appeared during the Clone Wars, and the Venators sometimes staged this same exterminatus. Another form of firepower came in the AV-7 anti-vehicle artillery cannon, albeit mounted to the vessel without legs, which could be operated by a single soldier and was also used as an artillery piece for Republic ground forces. The Venator's artillery decks featured long rows of many such cannons that aimed approximately perpendicular to the length of the ship in order to fire at vessels across from it, usually at close range. The AV-7 cannons and their ammunition were susceptible to exploding if struck by enemy fire when Venators brawled with opposing ships. The Venator was also equipped with at least 52-point defense laser cannons for anti-starfighter purposes. At least one kind was a swiveling double-barreled turret operated by a single gunner, which had a field of fire, left and right, and up and down, in which the turret could swing to attack a unit. For target practice, mechanical skeet packed with explosives could be launched from these gun emplacements, which a gunner would try to hit. A few more were along the central hangar. They covered fighters and bombers, and when the air group was launched, they improved the protection of the hangar during the battle. Also, these guns could intercept missiles or torpedoes, but as the experience of the war showed, even such an amount of light laser artillery did not always save from a swarm of separatists, bombers, and gunboats. Even for anti-ship combat, the Venator had 4 torpedo launchers. The total ammunition was 64 proton torpedoes, 16 torpedoes for each torpedo tube. If desired, they could be adapted to fire missiles, which also helped in repelling raids by droid fighter bomber midges. The Venator's arsenal doesn't end there. There were also 2 double-barreled medium turbolasers placed on the edge towards the front of the hull. It was they who, on the orders of Ramport, destroyed Tapoka City on Kamino in the new canon. Also, Anakin Skywalker thought of pushing a super-heavy self-propelled gun's PHA in its turbolaser version into Venator's lower hangar, and thereby increase the firepower of the ship in close combat in the lower hemisphere. Well, the last, so to speak, weapons are 6 tractor beam projectors. Their generators and part of the projectors were in the bow of the ship. Tractor beams were used to capture small ships, including for restricting maneuver. In other words, immobilizing the same fighters and bombers so that anti-aircraft gunners could shoot at them like in a shooting range. If necessary, tractor beam projectors could provide a soft landing of a badly damaged fighter, bomber, or even LAT. Now, let's talk about the air group of Venator himself. At the time of putting into service, then still secretly, it was planned to have up to 420 fighters and bombers on the upper hangar deck, in the lower hangar and in the side hangars, and up to several dozen shuttles, for example, from 20 to 40 LAT. The composition of the regular air group was to be as follows: 192 V-19 Torrent light starfighter. Later they were replaced by the same number of Alpha 3 Nimbus light fighters, 192 Delta 7 interceptors, later replaced by Eta 2 Actis, and 36 ARC-170 heavy fighters, 16 squadrons of light fighters, 16 squadrons of interceptors, and 3 squadrons of heavy fighters, plus up to 40 LAAT in infantry and transport versions, and several cargo passenger shuttles, for example, such as the Kappa-type shuttle. However, in reality, the Venators never flew with 450 fighters on board. It was unprofitable and even dangerous. Dangerous for the Republican budget. I will explain why later. Most of the ship's internal space, about 60% of its length, was reserved for one huge hangar, divided into different compartments, equipped with strong bulkheads, armored sliding doors, and force fields. Bulkheads were needed to better protect aircraft from enemy fire. If one of the compartments was knocked out, the fighters in the other compartment remained unharmed, and technical personnel could continue to work with them without problems. Armored shutters also serve as additional protection for each compartment. This was especially important when the aircraft carrier opened the main doors, and the force fields were needed to keep the atmosphere during the departure, when the doors were open. Each compartment contained several shuttles or fighters, sometimes up to a squadron, and could, if necessary, be closed with an armored sash. The bulkheads between the compartments could be retracted inside the hull, thereby increasing the internal space of the hangars and linking several compartments together. This partly removed the restrictions on the length of fighters in the hangar. Such restrictions, by the way, were used by Imperator-class Star Destroyers. Venator also had 2 side hangars, which served to receive and send shuttles and other light transport vessels. But if necessary, fighters and bombers could also nest there. The side hangars were connected to the main hangar by transporters and wide corridors. This made it easier to move aircraft between hangars inside the ship, as well as transport tools, equipment, and weapons. Another large hangar entrance exit was located in the belly of the ship. It is very convenient if you need to take off from the main hangar without opening massive gates into which the enemy can throw something explosive and very unpleasant. And it was also in this lower hangar that ships were brought in that they wanted to board. Remember the Tantive 4 boarding of Leia Organa in Episode 4? That's exactly the same way. And when Venator landed on the planet, something could be loaded through this hangar, for example, food, ammunition, equipment. For this there was a pair of cranes with a good carrying capacity, and they, the same cranes, were used to capture and hold the ship. By the way, side hangars could also be used for loading and unloading supplies. With the help of retractable docking arms, the ship could dock with space stations or like that when landing on the planet. The launch of fighters was carried out in several ways. It was considered to be the launch of an air group through the doors of the main hangar, opening along its entire length. On the one hand, this made it possible to release the entire air group into space in a short time. But on the other hand, it made the hangar very vulnerable to the guns of enemy ships, torpedoes, and bomber missiles. If the launch was carried out during the battle under enemy fire, sometimes it was more expedient to use the exit on the belly of the aircraft carrier. This method took more time, but the ship did not risk getting a flurry of torpedoes into a vulnerable hangar. It is worth noting that during the battle, many aircraft carriers were lost due to the desire of the ship commander to release the air group faster. The enemy, having managed to react in time, destroyed the ships with coordinated fire right into the hangar. And it also happened that a hangar that was not closed in time was used by resourceful separatists as an opening for the landing of a boarding team. This was once done even with Obi-Wan Kenobi's flagship. I also note that the use of side hangars and central sliding doors later when designing Star Destroyers of the Emperor class, that is ISD, was considered inappropriate and even dangerous, so ISD used only a hangar in the lower part of the hull. However, it would be useful to note the fact that some commanders managed to successfully release the Venator air group through sliding doors and under enemy fire. For example, during the battle for Ryloth, Admiral Yularen, together with Ahsoka Tano, simply turned his aircraft carrier belly to the enemy, thus blocking the fighters and bombers with the ship's hull. A risky move, but worth it. It was not in vain that I paid close attention to the method of launching an air group, because the speed of launching fighters and bombers directly affects the reaction time of both one aircraft carrier ship and the entire aircraft carrier formation to a change in the tactical situation. And now, for some numbers. How long did it take Venator to get his entire huge air group into the air? In total, there are 42 cells in the main hangar, each of which has a width of about 20 meters. 3 light fighters or 2 heavy fighters are placed in the cells. The side hangars could accommodate 12 light or 6 to 8 heavy fighters. Let's say that on our experimental Venator, the air group consists only of Nemubuses, only light fighters, and there is not a single LAAT in the flight deck and side hangars. All vehicles are armored, refueled, ready to take off, and pilots have already taken their seats in the cockpits, thirsting for separatist blood. That is, the ideal situation for combat, when the crew of the ship had time to fully prepare. As a result, in an ideal situation, you have 126 fighters in the main hangar, that is 10.5 squadrons, and no more than 24 aircraft, 2 squadrons, in the side hangars. In total, about 150 fighters out of 450 aircraft of the largest possible air group. At this time, the rest of the machines are in the hangar under the flight deck, and of course, they are not ready to take off. Getting them out of there and ready to take off takes time, in which the battle is likely to be over, because space battles in Star Wars are almost always fleeting. Of course, you can keep cars ready for takeoff on the main, so to speak, runway with the hangar closed, plus even in cells. Then, judging by the size, the runway can be prepared for takeoff by 2 more squadrons, that is, no more than 170 to 175 aircraft. Now about the launch speed. It can take place in several stages, in which the cars leave the hangar sequentially, cell by cell, or start simultaneously from different ends of the lane. In the second case, the launch speed will decrease when the Q reaches the machines in the middle cells. Judging by the takeoff speed in the Clone Wars animated series, it will take at least 3 to 5 minutes for all 150 aircraft, or even all 10 minutes if the guys from the Mission Control Center are a little crooked. 150 vehicles in 5 or 10 minutes, while the rest of the fighters will be on the ship for at least half an hour. And this is the ideal situation. In the case of a normal battle, when it can take several minutes from the appearance of opponents on the locator screens to the start of a firefight, the number of the raised air group will be much smaller, probably 70 to 100 vehicles. Now let's remember the Imperial Star Destroyer. The configuration of the ISD hangars is not the same on all ships of the series. There are minor differences. Sometimes there are several large compartments, but more often TIE vehicles are also placed in compartment cells, vaguely reminiscent of Venator ones. Option 2 is depicted in the magazine Incredible Cross-Section, on pages 6 to 7. On the Venator, the cell is protected by a force field that holds air, while on the ISD, each cell is covered by its own armored sash. There are 22 such cells on the Star Destroyer, of which 14 are used for TIE fighters and TIE interceptors. The rest contain shuttles, fighters with landing legs, and TIE bombers. The latter, along with the bombs, are located in a separate, well-armored compartment further away to protect the explosive cargo. On ISDs, as you know, TIAs hang from the ceiling, on special frames with rails, which speeds up their launch. Fighters can literally be pushed into space, which is also facilitated by the tractor beam projector. As a result, ISD can launch its entire air group much faster than Venator, approximately 1 to 3 minutes. In addition, his entire air group can be launched during the first unloading, since it is all located in the main hangar and not lying around somewhere, scattered in different parts of the ship. Bottom line, in a normal combat situation, the ISD could deploy 5 squadrons of light fighters, 1 squadron of heavy, and 1 squadron of bombers, a total of 84 aircraft against 100 vehicles of the Venator air group. In a duel situation, 60 TIE fighters will be able to cover their carrier ship from attacking enemy air groups, holding them somewhere along the way. At this time, the ISD deck artillery will disassemble the Venator into atoms. In addition, due to this bias towards the transportable air group, there was not much space for landing on Venator, which can also be considered a disadvantage. The dimensions of the Venator are as follows: length 1137 meter, width 548 meter, height 268 meter, taking into account the height of the superstructure. Most ships of this type had such dimensions, but there were slightly enlarged models with a length of 1155 meter. It would seem that 18M is a trifle for ships more than a kilometer long, but given its proportionally increasing width and height in this case, several compartments with valuable additional special equipment could be crammed into the enlarged Venator. A useful innovation of Lyra Wessex and her father was the interior of the captain's bridge, which later became familiar to subsequent Star Destroyers of most types. The main bridge personnel were located in, so to speak, pits, on the sides of the central aisle and the captain's chair. The Venator's right turret was the main bridge, which housed the ship's commander, radar operators, and the fire control panel. In the left tower, there is a mission control center, which was engaged in tactical coordination of the actions of the air group, and signalmen. At the same time, part of the flight control, mainly at the stage of takeoff and landing, was carried out from the command post located at the base of the hangar. They could also engage in tactical coordination there, in case one of the superstructure towers was destroyed. There was also a backup control panel for the helmsman, but it was not a full-fledged analog of the captain's bridge. You can often hear the statement about the vulnerability of the captain's bridges of Star Destroyers, with superstructures that protrude so much from the hull. Yes, this is partly true. But still, it is worth recalling that these bridges had good armor and were well covered by shield deflectors. Speaking of the latter, the shield generators were located next to the onboard hangars. Some of the main shield projects were also located there. The other shield projectors were placed inside the setting. This made the Venator shields harder to disable than the ISD shields, whose domes stuck out like targets at the top of the setup. To power the shields, powerful weapons, and generally the entire ship, the Venator had 3 hypermatter reactors. The main reactor was located aft, directly under the superstructures of the bridges, under reliable armor protection. 2 more auxiliary reactors were located in the triangular extensions of the ship in these parts. The power of the auxiliary reactors was sufficient to provide all the needs of the Venator, and most often they were turned off. Next to the auxiliary reactors were massive power cells, simply put, batteries, huge batteries, a few tens of meters high. On their charge, Venator could exist for some time and even fight somehow. This helped if, for example, it was necessary to take a heavily damaged ship out of battle with damaged or disabled reactors. Although it was rather problematic to disable the Venator reactors, and even more so cause them to detonate, even if the enemies really wanted to, and their ships had powerful cannons with good penetration, because the Venator reactors were completely hidden under the hull armor. On the one hand, this occupied valuable internal space. On the other hand, it improved survivability, and it was very difficult to de-energize the Venator, even with its massive shelling with ion cannons and missiles with ion warheads. Now let's talk about power. The peak total power of all 3 Venator reactors is, attention, 3.6 yottawatt, 10^24 degrees. This is, to put it mildly, very badass. The power of a small and weak star. For example, the total radiation power of our sun is estimated by scientists at 382.8 yottawatt. Therefore, the Venator reactors generate energy only 106 times less than the sun. Or here's another comparison. As of January 2021 at World, there are 443 energy reactor, not including those shut down for a long period, with a total capacity of about 393 gigawatt. That is the hypermaterial reactor of a single Venator, even without reaching its maximum power, produced more energy than all the nuclear power plants of our planet combined. Here you can either admire technologies from a galaxy far, far away, or the authors of the official guide Incredible Cross-Sections 3 episodes, to put it mildly, greatly exaggerated. Or maybe not, because we know examples of Star Wars reactors of the same or even greater power. You can write your opinion in the comments on this matter. Can the Venator consume so much energy? The reactor fuel tanks were located between the main hangar and the superstructure, along with the insulation, cooling system, pipelines, and other things that this dangerous substance was supposed to be. All this equipment, as you can see, took up a lot of space. A lot of space was occupied by engine nacelles, of which our aircraft-carrying cruiser had a whole 3-level bouquet. The Venator had 8 engines, 4 LF9 main ion engines manufactured by Alderaan Royal Engineers. Exactly the same marching ion engines were installed on Victory-class Star Destroyers, though not all of them. In addition to the 4 main engines, 4 auxiliary ion engines, the so-called levels 2 and 3, were installed on the Venator. Well, or secondary and tertiary, as you like. Most large warships use auxiliary engines during the acceleration phase, when gaining maximum speed and for maneuvering. But with the Venator, all engines were used for maneuvering, since the nozzles of each engine, equipped with electromagnetic plates with a complex system of force fields, could deviate in any direction. That is, each Venator engine had a deflectable thrust vector, like some modern American fighters of the 5th and 4th generations. Considering the size of the Venator's engines, it's not hard to imagine how complex the mechanization was there, and how difficult it was to repair it, in which case, without sending the ship to a dry dock, where there are appropriately sized cranes, force fields, gravity generators, and assembly droids. Why does the Venator need 8 engines at once? Everything is very simple. For survivability, so that it would be more difficult to immobilize the ship. I can't remember a single case during the entire period of operation of the Venator that it lost all engines from enemy fire at once, although there were cases when the Separatists managed to destroy all the main engines and part of the auxiliary engines. Of course, it would be even more difficult to remove the engines if they were installed in different places in the stern and covered as much as possible under the armor. Spaced engines were more difficult to detonate with one powerful and accurate volley. Although then, of course, Lyra Wessex and her engineers would have had to strain their brains a lot, inventing how to spread the engines aft without greatly increasing the width and height of the ship. After all, while the engines are one bunch next to the reactor, they can be installed relatively compactly. The place on the ship is not rubber. The Khatov engineers decided to move a third of the length of the engines beyond the dimensions of the hull, beyond the armor. The ship's engines were very powerful. The whole bunch of 8 engines accelerated the aircraft carrying cruiser to 40 space units, 40 MGLT. It was 20 units less than the Imperial Star Destroyer, but still decent for such a ship. But the speed of the Venator in the atmosphere was almost at the level of modern airliners, only 975 km/h. However, a kilometer-long ship has no place in the atmosphere. I will talk about atmospheric flights a little further. The maximum acceleration of the Venator was 3000 g. Naturally, with such an acceleration, an inertial compensator would be needed. Otherwise, with a rapid increase in speed, huge overloads would instantly turn the crew of the ship into a fascinating riddle for the pathologist. The inertial compensator, cooling, and junk disposal systems, as well as the hyperdrive, were located at the stern, in a kind of tail between the ion engines. This improved their defense in typical Star Wars head-on combat. For some reason, Quat's shipbuilders were very fond of placing hyperdrives in the stern. By the way, Acclamator's hyperdrive was also located there. As you understand, if the enemy came to the Venator from the stern, hyperdrives can easily be disabled, because the thickness of the armor in the tail is quite small. Well, in this case, Venator has an answer, in the form of an auxiliary hyperdrive hidden inside the hull. To destroy it, you need to pick open almost the entire ship. The speed of the hyperdrive was excellent, and the navigational supercomputer was the envy of many. First class by the standards of the time, it was almost the maximum speed for ships of this size. But the auxiliary hyperdrive on the Venator was installed from 12 to 15 classes. On it, the ship flew very slowly, although this will do if you need to hobble to the repair dock, and the ship is in a deplorable state. The maximum flight range of the Venator at one refueling of the reactors was 60,000 light-years. In combination with the ship's autonomy of 2 years, this allowed the Venator to go on very long raids. With such a high staffing of the ship, there was also a place for the crew with the landing, albeit a little. Only 2,000 cloned paratroopers and a minimum of armored vehicles traveled inside, while a full-fledged legion of stormtroopers could be accommodated inside the ISD. This is 9,700 soldiers and more than 100 armored vehicles, including AT-AT from 1 to 2 more rapid deployment bases, and for a snack up to a naval infantry regiment. Although sometimes the Venator's lower hangar was still converted for the transport of troops, which made it possible to place more armored vehicles there, and even make cabins for cloned cannon fodder. But this refinement with a file is clearly not always conductive. However, this is not scary, because the Venator was not a landing ship. The role of the large landing craft in the Clone Wars fell to the Acclamators. The Venator had a crew of 7,400. Not very many, given the number of crews on other warships of a similar size of that era. For example, the ISD crew was 36,000 people. A small comparison with the real world. The U.S. Navy aircraft carrier Gerald R. Ford, which is 337 meters long, has a crew of 4,660 people. At the beginning of the Clone Wars, Venator's crew consisted only of clones, due to the secrecy of the army itself. But at the end of the war, many Venators had non-cloned crews. Admiral Wolf Yularen is a well-known example. It is difficult to say exactly what percentage of non-clones were in the crews. The sources do not specify. Part of the crew cabins and medical compartments were located in the superstructure, and immediately below it, above the reactor. In particular, it was there that most of the crews of turbolaser and laser guns lived, and the technical staff, especially those guys who monitored the operation of the engines and the reactor in order to shorten the distance to the duty station. The cabins of the rest of the crew were located on the edge of the hull. If the Venator was fired on the side, these cabins served as a kind of additional armor to protect vital compartments. As mentioned above, Venator could land on the surface of the planet. It could be any flat, but very hard surface, because the ship is tens of thousands of tons. It could be specially prepared landing sites. You saw examples of these in Episode 3, but the Venators tried not to get into the atmosphere. The reason for this was enemy air defense, anti-aircraft defense, and even cannon artillery with high power, from which you should stay away. Possessing good maneuverability in space, in the atmosphere, the Venator turned into a very convenient, clumsy, and easy target. which everyone wanted to shoot at. Therefore, the landing force carried was small. As mentioned above, it was simply dangerous to enter the ship into the atmosphere for its landing. And from space, it was not possible at first to do this from the first versions of LAAT, which lacked the possibility of spaceflight. From the early days of the Clone Wars, the Venator became the main battleship of the Republic fleet. Victory-class Star Destroyers appeared later, but they still did not meet the needs of the time so well due to the modest size of the hangar. Although in conjunction with the Venators, the Pobeda could do a lot of things, good for the Republic, and very unpleasant things for the Confederation. Victory had excellent missiles and cannons, while Venator had a large air group and also good cannons. Victory began to be massively built from the second half of the Clone Wars, but the mass production of Venators was established even before the war. Their construction proceeded at a truly tremendous pace. From the moment of laying down the first modules of the ship, to the commissioning of the finished starship, 3 and sometimes 2 months passed, and the assembly of the modules and their installation were simultaneously carried out on thousands of stocks. Needless to say, the Old Republic had never seen such a large-scale construction of warships even during the years of the Great Galactic War, both the first and the second. Ships were not built so quickly then. There was no need. However, at that time, the production technologies were not so developed. At least this fact speaks about the scale of production of Venators. In the Battle of Coruscant, one of the most important battles of the war, the Republic was able to field 1,000 Venators on the battlefield. Try to imagine this armada, 1,000 aircraft carrying cruisers, and together with ships of other types and classes, that was a massacre. The Separatist fleet over Coruscant, by the way, also consisted of 1,000 ships. But such massive battles were rare. During the Clone Wars, the fleet of the Grand Army preferred to operate in relatively small squadrons, task forces of 3-4 Venators each. Interestingly, sometimes such squadrons did not even have escort ships in the form of light cruisers and corvettes. This was due to the presence of a huge air group capable of adequately protecting the carrier ship from any threat. After the end of the Clone Wars, the work of the Venators did not become less. Although by the end of the war, several thousand Victory-class Star Destroyers had already been stamped. And, at the very curtain of the theater of war, the Kuatians released their new masterpiece, the Emperor-class Star Destroyer. On the stage, the Venators continued to be the basis of the fleet of the young Galactic Empire for several more years. After the defeat of the remnants of the Separatists, a large-scale reform of the fleet went at an even greater pace. The strategy of warfare has also changed, again becoming inclined towards the concept of large artillery ships. The Venators, which were a hybrid of a heavy cruiser and an aircraft carrier, did not really fit into the new realities, although at the same time they continued to be one of the best ships of this class in the galaxy. In addition, local conflicts and uprisings that raged in some places did not require the use of numerous air groups, but the ability to transport a lot of troops, and at the same time, have powerful artillery on board to actively support the troops from space was what the young Imperial state needed. Gradually, Venators began to be replaced by Emperors and Victories. ISD Imperial Command considered more promising ships, even despite their huge cost. For the Venator, the Republic Treasury had to shell out 59 million credits. But the Emperor cost the Republican and then the Imperial taxpayers already 150 million. Although the price could vary greatly depending on the modification of the ship. Some modifications cost 100 million. And there were ISDs stuffed with such expensive equipment that the price for them soared right up to 180 million. The available Venators were carefully analyzed by the Special Commission for further exploitation. After the bloody war and the post-war finishing off of the unfinished Separatists, the destruction of pirates and other enemies of the regime, there were many ships that received damage of varying severity. Repair of some of them was considered inexpedient, although possible. It was these ships that were cut up for scrap on many garbage planets, including in the new canon, for example, in the game Jedi Fallen Order. Naturally, weapons, reactors, electronics, and other valuables were removed from them beforehand, for later use in the construction of new ships, or for sale on the secondary market. During the Galactic Civil War, Venators could be found in Imperial service in the sector fleets of the Outer Rim worlds, in secondary directions. Moffs in all sorts of backwaters also did not stand aside and sometimes used Venators as their flagships, and at the same time as personal vehicles. Imperial Venators differed from the ships of the Grand Army only in their coloration, a solid gray color, while the ships of the Great Army were brightly painted and sometimes carried the emblems of their fleets and squadrons. In the Imperial Navy, these drawings were considered superfluous, and the last role that the Imperials assigned to the old Venators was that of a mobile training center for the training of fighter pilots. For this role, the flying airfield was perfect. There were also 2 references to the use of Venators by commercial companies as ordinary transporters, container ships. Yeah, it's very humiliating for such a beautiful aircraft carrier to work as just a truck. Although it must be admitted that in this role Venator could also show his best side, which was facilitated by a large and convenient central hangar, and the presence of several additional hangars that facilitated the loading and unloading of cargo shuttles, and made it possible to simultaneously serve several transport ships of different classes. Even a pirate group is known that had a Venator in its fleet. However, the pirate Lady of Fortune in the end turned to the bandits by no means face. But the Rebel Alliance, apparently, could not get a single Venator. At least, I did not find any mention of this, which is somewhat strange, given how actively the rebels used the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Confederate Navy. When the Galactic Empire began to rapidly fall apart after the Battle of Endor, the Venators, although not immediately but still began to use some of the Imperial fragments. Let's sum up and give the ship an assessment according to the following criteria. Armament, plus. Vitality, plus. Air group, plus. Here is a moot point. Speed in hyper, plus. Speed in space, plus. Crew, plus. Landing, minus. That is 6 from 7. According to the 10-point system, it turns out 8.5 from 10. We can round it up to 8 from 10. You can give your assessment of this ship in the comments. In conclusion, I want to say that I, like many others, really like Venator. But it also has some downsides. But for all its shortcomings, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was a superb ship of its era, a more than fitting response to the military doctrine of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And right after the Clone Wars, he served the Galactic Empire very well. The Venators had a reputation for being versatile ships that can become a reliable argument in solving even the most complex military issues. And it is the Venator that can be considered the ancestor of a long series of ships that bore the proud name Star Destroyer.